The traditional history of 1945 centers on liberation. As Allied forces collapsed the Nazi regime, rapid advances across the map ended continental occupation, offering a sense of moral resolution to the Second World War. But the arrival of the Red Army in places like Poland and Hungary triggered a secondary reality. For millions of women in Central and Eastern Europe, the presence of liberating forces initiated a period of lawless, mass sexual violence. Official state accounts systematically excised this violence from the historical record. The Red Army had to be strictly framed as liberators, making any acknowledgement of their atrocities politically forbidden. The memory of the war became exclusively male, textbooks filled with combat strategies and geopolitical treaties, while the bodily trauma of civilian women was reduced to rumors or buried entirely by state censors. Confronting this systemic erasure, survivors faced a binary choice: absorb the trauma into total silence, or forge their own medium to force it into the historical record. Women writers utilized personal narratives as a targeted psychological intervention against that state-mandated amnesia. We can visualize this divide here. Translating bodily trauma into language requires a specific syntax, what researchers call a vocabulary of rupture. This syntax is highly visible in Elaine Poltz's memoir, A Sonia Affronton, and The Anonymous Diary, A Woman in Berlin. By documenting the exact mechanics of their survival, these authors reclaimed their agency. They actively rejected the helpless, passive victim roles assigned to them by their governments and societies. This writing process operated as scriptotherapy. It is a sovereign act of objectifying pain, deployed as a direct countermeasure against state censorship and the internal encryption of psychological trauma. Mapping this out as a clinical flowchart, we can understand the psychological framework of war rape survivor syndrome. Post-traumatic stress anchors deeply when survivors encounter a structural failure of symbolic integration. In post-war Poland and Hungary, naming the violence threatened the legitimacy of the Soviet occupation. The state enforced a macro-political imperative of total silence. Micro-social taboos exacerbated this environment. Mothers instructed daughters to stay quiet to protect their marriageability, and returning defeated husbands refused to listen to their wives' accounts of assault. When symbolization is blocked, the unacknowledged trauma is forced into implicit memory systems. It generates intense physiological distress and creates transgenerational symptoms within family systems. The alternative psychological route is articulation. Through narrative and public witnessing, the memory is exposed, symbolized, and eventually integrated. Silence functions as an active vector of trauma transmission, ensuring the psychological aftermath of war moves into the next generation. When examining the period of lawlessness following the war, female survival strategies starkly contradict the passive victimhood portrayed in post-war male-authored literature. In the rubble years fiction of authors like Geert Ledig, the physiological reality of starvation is cleaved away from the reality of sexual violence. Female characters are reduced to passive, silent objects awaiting destruction. Look at this line for food rations. In female-authored memoirs, hunger and sexual violence are inextricably linked. Survival in this environment required brutal physiological calculation. Women deployed a psychological defense tactic known as somatic splitting, consciously detaching their core identity from their subjugated bodies during an assault to preserve sanity. They also utilized highly calculated sexual bartering. Women traded sex with a single, higher-ranking soldier specifically to secure food and ensure protection from random gang rapes. In the ruins, tight female subcultures formed. Survivors weaponized dark gallows humor to dissect the sexual inadequacy of their assaulters, dismantling male power dynamics and forging protective communal bonds. What male literature coded as passive victimization was a highly rational, sovereign method of survival enacted inside an environment of total systemic collapse. Scriptotherapy provides the precise mechanical function to halt the transmission of that trauma. The mechanism relies on pain objectification. Moving suffering out of the nervous system and giving it structure through language diminishes its internal destructive power. Elaine Poltz's memoir acts as a clinical case study. She records the details of gang rape and physical trauma with blunt, unsentimental precision. There are no metaphors to soften the blow. This unadorned prose is Poltz's literal vocabulary of rupture. This linguistic objectification allowed her to view the memory rationally, dissect the event, and forge a newly integrated post-war identity. The physical act of writing extracts the encrypted trauma from the survivor's biology and places it permanently onto the page. Direct realism, however, is not the only valid methodology. Judith Kovács employs a structurally distinct approach in her text, Megtagadva. Rather than singular autobiography, Kovács constructed a fictionalized narrative relying on collected oral histories from multiple survivors. Kovács centers her text on a first-person narrator who frequently dissociates, speaking of herself as two entirely different people to survive the recollection. This literary distance proves highly effective for narrating the trauma of young victims who lacked previous sexual experience and could not process the horror in an adult context. The disassociation in the text perfectly mirrors the real-time survival strategy of somatic splitting, enacting the psychological defense retroactively through the architecture of the book. Whether utilizing blunt realism or fictionalized disassociation, both textual methods bypass societal silencing to construct a valid, permanent vocabulary of rupture. When society mandates silence, trauma remains somatic. In this state, it persists as a transgenerational weight, moving into family dynamics as inherited affect. Scriptotherapy disrupts this pathology. Claiming narrative space forces a traumatic experience out of the body and explicitly symbolizes it. This directly targets the rigid framework of the traditional historical record. Female testimony disrupts the timelines of treaties and statecraft, forcing marginalized bodily realities back into the core timeline. Writing reorganizes the historical wound. The text extracts a memory from the hidden domain of state shame and installs it into a public archive of historical memory. These texts force a severe rereading of the Second World War's conclusion, challenging the monolithic memory of a mastered, male-dominated past. Memoirs like A Woman in Berlin and À son affronton dismantle simple ideological binaries separating victim and perpetrator, or absolute victory and total defeat. These authors explicitly refused the silent, passive roles demanded by both their defeated husbands and the victorious occupying states. By translating bodily rupture into a permanent vocabulary, these women proved that the physical act of writing is an act of sovereign survival. The archive of war remains dangerously incomplete without the embodied, articulated truth of its survivors.